Hello, I'm Olly and this is CriminOlly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, everything I read in November. Before I get into the wrap-up, give me just 1 minute to talk to you about today's sponsor, Serious Readers. So as you probably know, I've had one of their high-definition floor lights for a few months now, and I absolutely love it. The quality of the light is phenomenal. It really is like reading in daylight. But there's one thing about the light that hadn't even occurred to me. My wife pointed this out to me the other day, and that is how unobtrusive it is for other people in the room. So because the light is so focused, even though it's really bright, other people in the room don't get disturbed by it. So quite often in the evenings, my wife will watch TV with the main light in the lounge off, and I will read using the Serious Readers light. She said she barely even notices I'm there, which I think is a plus for her. Anyway, the lights are beautifully made, really nicely designed. If you're interested, do check out the link in the description to this video, and remember to use the code OLLY24 to get £100 off your first order. Anyway, let's get back to the wrap-up. So this is everything I read in November. 15 physical books, 6 ebooks. I'll go through them in the order that I read them, and then at the end I'll tell you my favourite book of the month. So it was a pretty good reading month for me. Not an amazing reading month. I didn't read a huge amount because most of these books, as you can see, are quite short. But it was a really enjoyable month. I had a good time. And I read a lot of novelisations this month. So I was taking part in a YouTube event, Novelisation and Tie-in Timber, run by Andrew from the channel It Came From The Page. So there's quite a few kind of movie novelisations and tie-ins in this pile. So without further ado, let me get on with it. So the first thing I finished this month was an indie horror novel, The Sin of the Fathers by Tony Hernandez, which I really enjoyed. So a really nice mix of kind of crime and horror about these 4 young Latino guys who get involved in a crime and then pay for that crime over the years thereafter. So part of it set in the 80s, part of it when they're young guys, part of it set in the 90s when they're older, when they've got families. I thought the whole thing was really, really well done. Tony is launching that book on Kickstarter. I'll leave a link to the Kickstarter page in the description to this video, but it's a great mix of kind of really good character work, some creepy stuff, and just a really great sense of time and place. I thought it was a very, very well done for an indie book. After that then, another horror novel, The Sentinel by Jeffrey Konvitz, which is a 70s horror novel. It was filmed in the 70s as well by British director Michael Winner. Not a fantastic book. So one of those books that falls into the kind of wave of like religious type horror that happened in the late 60s and 70s. So, you know, think about things like The Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist. This is definitely one of the lesser books in that cycle, I think. But it was kind of fun. So it's about this young woman who moves into this weird apartment building in New York. There's all sorts of strange stuff going on. And as she starts to investigate, things get weirder and weirder. So there was some enjoyably kind of grotesque stuff in this book. Like some of the other people who live in the apartment building were enjoyably weird. But overall, it wasn't that great. After that, I returned to one of my favourite series, the Executioner series by Don Pendleton. So this is book 25 in that series, Colorado Killzone, featuring the hero Mac Bolan going up against the mafia as he does in all of these early books. So later on in the series, and it ended up being over 400 books, he becomes more of a kind of a spy type character. But in the early books, he's a one-man army going up against the mafia. In this book, he does it in Colorado on a ski resort. There's also a fiendish plot going on that goes a lot wider than the stuff in these books normally does. But it was really fun. So basically, Matt Bolan up a mountain, getting chased by the mafia and gradually taking them down. I enjoyed it a lot. Next up then, another book that I read for novelisation and Tie-in Timber. In fact, the first book I read for novelisation and Tie-in Timber, that was Rebel Moon, episode 1 by V. Castro. So Rebel Moon, if you remember, was a 2-part Netflix movie made by Zack Snyder. It was fun to read a novelisation of a relatively new film. Most of the novelisations I've read, and indeed some of the other ones I read this month, were for much older things. I used to love novelisations when I was a kid, when I couldn't always get to the cinema to see movies, and particularly when I couldn't see movies because I wasn't old enough, I would read the novelisations of them. But it's kind of an art form, if you like, that's died out. There have been recently some novelisations of like older horror movies, like 80s horror movies, but typically you don't get novelisations anymore for new movies, so it was fun to see a novelisation of a new movie, even if it was a movie I didn't particularly love. I thought it was okay, Rebel Moon, but I didn't think it was fantastic. So V. Castro did a good job of it. It's a fun, pulpy kind of science fantasy adventure. There's kind of some Western themes in there. She does a good work with the characters and things like that. It wasn't an amazing book, but it was definitely a fun, diverting read. Next up then, we have another one for novelisation and tie-in timber, Space Babies by Alison Rumfitt. So Alison Rumfitt is a great author of like really quite extreme horror novels. So to see her do a novelisation of a Doctor Who episode was something that I was just delighted by the concept of, and I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was an excellent adaptation of the episode. Some of the problems I had with the episode, which is about a space station that's full of babies, so it's a place that's basically a baby factory for the planet that it orbits. And the babies, who are these kind of like weird little kids basically that float around in the kind of these like floating chairs and things like that. In the episode, I found them a little bit annoying and a bit creepy. They're a bit weird the way they're done in the episode. In the book, they work much better because you can't actually see them. So yeah, it was fun. There was some enjoyable kind of tense, creepy stuff in this. Some really good humour, a little bit of politics. Overall, it was a really fun read. Next up then, some vintage sci-fi. So I read Perry Rhodan Book 8 by Clarke Darlton, The Galactic Riddle. So Perry Rhodan is a German series of sci-fi novellas. There's over 3,000 of them at this point. During the 70s, they were briefly, some of them were translated into English and published in the UK and the US. This was fun. So Perry Rhodan is basically this guy who goes around the galaxy. He's got a crew of people who've all got different powers who help him out. In this one, they are trying to solve the mystery of a solar system where one of the planets appears to be missing. So it was just fun, cheesy, pulpy, old-fashioned sci-fi. It's got ray guns and rocket ships and stuff like that. It was an entertaining read. Next up, a bit of crime, The Sailcloth Shroud by Charles Williams. So this is a lovely vintage paperback edition that one of my viewers sent me a while ago. This was very, very entertaining. So just a taut detective thriller. Basically, the setup is this guy has sailed a boat back from the Caribbean to the US with a crew of 2 other people apart from him. One of the crew members dies during the voyage, and the other one dies shortly after they get back to the US. And he then gets investigated by the local cops, and it's about him trying to unpick what's happened and prove his innocence. So just a really fun mystery thriller. And I'll definitely be reading some more Charles Williams. I've got his book Dead Calm as well, which was filmed in the 90s, I think, with Nicole Kidman. Next up, some cosy crime. So Agatha Raisin and the Potted Gardener. So I've been really enjoying the Agatha Raisin books. This is, I think, the 3rd one. They're very silly, but they're entertaining mysteries. So they're set in this small town in Norfolk. Agatha Raisin is this slightly abrasive woman who's retired there. And in this one, she enters a gardening competition, and one of the other competitors in the competition ends up dead, and it's about her trying to solve the mystery. So just a fun mystery. It's a nice setting. There's a little bit of romance thrown in throughout the books as well. So just a very enjoyable read. MC Beaton started life as a romance reader, and romance writer rather, and you definitely see that coming through in the books. Next, another one for novelisation and tie-in timber. This was Haunted by Desire by Cameron Dokey, a novelisation of an episode of the Charm TV show. So this volume actually has 2 in. So the first one, The Power of 3, I read in August. Actually, no, I read in October. So that was an adaptation of the first episode. Haunted by Desire, I think it's like the 7th or 8th episode. It wasn't as good as the first one. It wasn't as good as The Power of 3, but it was still quite entertaining. So it has one of the sisters investigating some murders that happened a couple of decades previously at the local university, and ghosts to do with those murders are haunting the university. And then the other two sisters get taken in by this warlock who seduces both of them. So it was very silly but quite entertaining. Speaking of silly but entertaining, we then get into some Sweet Valley High books that I read. So I did these as a buddy read with MJ from the YouTube channel Reading This Life, and it was really, really fun. So 3 books in this series. So I was aware of the Sweet Valley High series, but didn't really know very much about it. And I thought that it was kind of cosy and cutesy, but actually these are all kind of crime horror books, basically. Quite tame crime horror books, it must be said, but that's what they are. So in these ones, the Sweet Valley twins, who are these 2 twins from California, go to London to work as interns on a London newspaper. And whilst they're there, there's a murder. They get involved in investigating the murder, even though they're not supposed to be, and it appears to have been a murder by a werewolf. So in these books, they are trying to figure out if there really is a werewolf, and if there is, who it is. There's a series of murders throughout the books. They're not particularly brutal, but they're kind of more brutal than I expected from Sweet Valley High. So there's a nice bit of mystery running through it. There's a bit of romance. Both of the twins end up hooking up with various boys who they meet. So yeah, a bit of romance, bit of mystery, and a bit of horror. It was a fun series. I really, really enjoyed it. There's a Sweet Valley High vampire series as well, which I'm hoping to read soon. Okay, after that then, we get into Blood Standard by Laird Barron. So the first Laird Barron book I've read. This will definitely not be the last Laird Barron book I read. This was fantastic. I've done a review of it, which is up on YouTube and TikTok. I really enjoyed this a lot. So a really dark thriller about this big bruising guy called Isaiah Coleridge, who's a mafia enforcer in Alaska. So Alaska was a great setting, and turns up as a setting in one of the other books I read this month as well. So he gets booted out of the mafia in Alaska because he disapproves of something they do and reacts against it. He goes to upstate New York. He's staying on a farm. They've given him a good kicking, basically. So he's recuperating on this farm in upstate New York, and a local girl goes missing, and he gets involved in trying to find her. Just a really good detective thriller, really dark at times, some decent action sequences. I thought it was fantastic. Really, really enjoyed it. After that, I read Rumpole of the Bailey by John Mortimer, a very enjoyable short story collection. So this is the first of a series of short story collections featuring this character, Rumpole of the Bailey, who's a barrister working out the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court in London. So each of the short stories is just a different case, and they all have enjoyable twists and turns to them. There's a lot of humour in these stories, but also a really insightful kind of investigation of British society and also the British legal system. So really, really fun. I was familiar with Rumpole as a character because there was a very well-known TV series on UK TV in the 80s based on him. But it was a very enjoyable experience to read some of the stories, and I'll definitely go back and read some more at some point. After that, another Doctor Who novelisation, Wild Blue Yonder by Mark Morris. This was another really entertaining book. So I used to love Doctor Who books when I was a kid, and it was really fun this month reading a couple of them. Again, so Mark Morris, a British horror author who I really admire. He's written some great horror novels. And this was a very, very entertaining adaptation of the episode. So it's a particularly good episode. I think it's a better episode than Space Babies. It's really tense. So it has the Doctor and his assistant Donna going to investigate this weird empty spaceship. So they end up on this abandoned spaceship at the edge of the galaxy, and it's about them trying to figure out what's going on. There's a really good kind of countdown, like race against time type element to it. And I just thought Mark Morris captured all of that really well in the book. There's one sequence halfway through the book as well, which was super creepy, much more creepy than I remember it being in the TV show. So yeah, another really good adaptation. After that, a fantastic horror novella by an author who I'd heard of only recently and had never read anything by. That's Joel Lane, and the novella is The Witnesses Are Gone. this was phenomenally good. So this is a cursed movie style of book about this guy who discovers a box of video cassettes when he moves into a new house, and one of them has this weird kind of experimental film on it by a director he's vaguely heard of, but who he really struggles to track down any information about. And it's about his obsession with this director and about him trying to find out more about him. It's really weird and kind of dreamlike at times, this book. Very, very creepy. And feels like a much longer book than it is. So it's only about 70 pages, but it feels like kind of a 300-page novel in terms of the amount of stuff that Joel Lane managed to cram into this book. I really thought it was phenomenally good. Next up, another fantastically good and creepy horror novel, Apartment 16 by Adam Nevill. So this was very, very creepy, very entertaining. So set in an apartment building in London where there's weird goings on. It centres on two characters, April, who's an young American woman who's come over to England because her great aunt lived in the building and died in mysterious circumstances. So she's come over to figure out, like, put her great aunt's effects in order, basically. And then there's also a young guy called Seth, who's a security guard who works in the building, and who has like a dark past. So it's just really, really well done. It gets creepier and creepier as the book progresses, and when you find out what's really going on, it's just fantastically handled. It uses some horror tropes that I really, really enjoy. I won't tell you what they are, so I don't spoil the book, but I thought it was a fantastically tense and creepy book. Adam Nevill is a horror writer I'm really coming to admire, and looking forward to reading some more stuff by him. Next up then, a short story collection, which I wasn't expecting much from at all. So this is a collection I've had a digital copy of for years and years and years, and had just never got around to reading. But one of the prompts for novelisation and Tie and Timber was to read a book based on a video game. So the video game I chose was LA Noire, which is a video game that came out a good few years ago now, that kind of pays homage to like noir movies and novels and things like that. So this is a series of short stories that was published to coincide with the release of the game. But it's got some fantastic writers in there. So there's a story by Lawrence Block, there's one by Joel Lansdale, there's one by Joyce Carol Oates. So some really great writers who I really enjoy reading. My favourite two stories, so all the stories in this were fun. My favourite two were Joyce Carol Oates' story, which is about a friendship between Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Short, who was the victim of the Black Dahlia murders. So just a really interesting examination of both of their lives, kind of trying to tie them together, and just about how women were treated at that time. So just a fantastically rich short story, quite weird but very, very enjoyable. And then the other one was by an author who I hadn't heard of before, called Francine Prose. So a really fun, kind of punchy, noirish story set in LA about an acting class where actors go to learn how to be convincing murderers in films. Just really beautifully done, a very, very enjoyable pulpy story. So yeah, that's a collection I wasn't expecting that much from, but actually it was fantastically good. After that, a book that wasn't fantastically good, another novelisation. This was the novelisation of Neil Simon's film Murder by Death by H.R.F. Keating. So H.R.F. Keating is was a well-known, quite prolific, quite successful British crime writer. I've not read anything by him until I read this, and this wasn't very good, but I will definitely give him a second chance because I can see why this didn't work. So Murder by Death, I haven't seen the film, but it looks like it's one of those big 70s like comedy movies with an all-star cast. So it's got like Peter Sellers, Peter Falk, Truman Capote, like quite an interesting cast. But it's a very kind of slapstick style of humour. And it just doesn't work in novelisation form. I can see how it might have been amusing on screen, especially with some great actors in it. But as a book, it just the humour just doesn't really come over. There's some individual lines which are quite funny, which work well in the book. But overall, it was a bit of a dud. So the plot is that this millionaire invites a load of detectives to come and stay at his house and have dinner and solve a murder. So the detectives are all based on like fictional detectives, so like Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot and people like that. But yeah, very silly and not very well done, to be honest with you. After that, something more enjoyable, The Gunsmith, book 319, Out of the Past by J.R. Roberts. So I always assume with these books that are like in really, really long series that different people have actually written the books. But I looked up J.L. Roberts and it was actually one guy. So he published over 650 books in his career, which is insane. So this was one of those kind of slightly smutty, very formulaic westerns about this guy, the gunsmith. In this book, this teenage girl who claims to be his daughter comes and finds him and approaches him and says that her mother, who's a woman that he had a relationship with years ago, has been murdered, and he goes off to investigate the murder. So just a fun mix of kind of a bit of a mystery, a bit of kind of gunslingy and stuff like that, a little bit of smut, just an enjoyable quick read. And then the last thing I read this month was by an author who I've been meaning to read for a while, CJ Tudor. I've had a copy of her book, The Jigsaw Man, for ages and just haven't got around to it. So I've read her latest book, The Gathering, which is a vampire novel, which was really enjoyable. So a great concept. So the concept is that vampires are real, but there's very few of them left, and they live in kind of small communities away from humanity, but humanity knows they are there, and the two groups kind of tolerate each other basically. So they are almost like a protected species. So it's set in Alaska, and it features this detective who specialises in like vampire-related crimes, basically, who goes to Alaska to investigate the murder of a teenage boy. And the locals think that the vampires did it, and there's a lot of tension between the two groups. So it's a nice setup, nice concept. That kind of small town crime setup, I think, often works really well in crime novels, and this was no exception. So it was an enjoyable mystery, had some really interesting kind of vampire stuff woven into it, and just very well crafted. So the central character, Barbara, this detective, was really fun to read. The town was well, kind of represented on the page. Some of the townspeople are characters, and it was enjoyable reading them. So overall, just a fun, entertaining kind of mix of mystery and horror. I had a really good time with it. So that is everything I read in November. Time for me to pick my book of the month, which is one of the physical books on the pile here. So I think it's going to have to be The Witnesses Are Gone by Joel Lane. I just thought this was so beautifully done, really, really creepy, and so effective that such a short book had such a big impact on me. I really thought it was excellent. Joel Lane sadly passed away a good few years ago now, but I do have a couple of short story collections by him, which people have been recommending to me, so I'm going to dive in and read those soon. So I hope you found that interesting. Do let me know what your favourite book you read in November was. Let me know if you've read any of the books I talked about. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.